Hello and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor of Renew Economy, editor-in-chief of Renew Economy, and editor of its EV-focused sister site, The Driven. And joining me, as usual, is RTK Principal David Leach. David, I trust you are well.
Beautiful spring day here in Sydney, Giles. I trust all our listeners are enjoying the good weather. Haven't we?
You're wearing a jacket, David. I presume you're drumming up business.
I'd love to be drumming up business. I've been drumming, but the business hasn't listened to the tune. I'll have to change it. I don't know what the Pied Piper did, but he certainly had one over me.
Well, maybe you need to wear a tie. I don't know. I'm just suggesting. But anyway. Look, we do have a very good guest today on one of your favourite topics too, about where's the money. And then later on we'll get onto the news of the week, including some interesting developments over at Australia's most powerful battery. But David, let's first have a listen to our interview with Jeremy Cooper, the author of the eponymous, I'm told, super review and a former deputy chairman of the Australian Securities Investment Commission and a keen watcher and observer of the superannuation industry. We caught up with Jeremy earlier this week to the Energy Insiders podcast.
Great to be here, Giles. I've been listening to you two guys for a couple of years now, and here I am. I'm actually getting my turn.
Oh, look, well, we're delighted to have you on board. And especially so because you've written a report. There's been a couple of reports coming out of the institute that you're connected with, the Connexus Institute. You wrote a wonderful commentary piece for us about the parlor state of the super industry, at least in regards to its investments in the clean energy transition and climate-related things. But look, before we get going too far, you better tell us who you are and what you've been doing. And you've been deputy chair of the Australian Securities Investment Commission. You chaired your own eponymous review of the superannuation industry. Anything else I've missed out?
Eponymous, yeah, that's good. Yeah, look, so I've had 4 decades of white collar career, if I can put it that way. So I spent 2 decades as an M&A lawyer. Then I got sick of that and ended up being the deputy chair of ASIC, which is a wonderful experience. That was in the mid 2000s and right through the GFC and so on. And as that finished, the government asked me to, I had the great privilege of reviewing the entire super system really from the bottom up for the first time that had really been done. And so I did that for a year. And then after that, I went off to, I felt that the retirement phase of super was possibly the weakest space. And so I spent 12 years working in a sort of thought leadership advocacy role for Challenger. And at the end of that, that was a great period. We got legislation passed in 2022 that sought to do more in retirement for people, and agreed mutually that it was time to go and do something else. I thought, okay, well, what am I going to do now? And I took quite a break, and then I realised that the most interesting thing I could spend time looking at was what you guys get together each week and talk about. And I suppose my orientation was perhaps looking at it from the pension system, superannuation, financial services side of it, although not exclusively. And so that's where I've really found myself scratching, looking at problems and trying to solve them. And it's amazing how quickly I've sort of got into the group.
We don't have enough people, I don't think, looking at the super industry, which is one of the fastest changing and most interesting thing going on in the Australian economy. But Giles, I'll come back with. I've got a lot to say about. But
up to you. Absolutely do. And for those watching this podcast on video, when David and I took our cups of tea to our lips at the same time, that was not deliberately choreographed, but it was quite funny to watch. The problem, Jeremy, there's $4.6 trillion in the superannuation, and bugger all of it is invested into climate and energy related industries. Why is that?
Okay, well, it's like a big wood heap, lots of different reasons putting pressure on progress. Let's start with the numbers. So 4.6 would probably be about right, but well over a trillion. You get into some pretty big numbers with super. So at least $1 trillion of that, let's call it 1.1, 1.2, is actually in the self-managed sector. And because the self-managed sector sort of is an individual structure where about 1.3 million Australians generally couples are in their self-managed super funds, you can't really effectively tell them what to do. You can incentivize them to do things, but so far, really, they've been left to their own devices in this problem. Maybe we come back to them.
About my Linus share sales in my super fund, but time doesn't permit.
Hey,
go on.
Snap. Okay, so it's what we call big super. So the APRA regulated super funds that most Australians are in. That's where you really need to start. Firstly, and Giles mentioned these two papers. Firstly, in investigating, well, what's actually going on here, and if not much is going on, what are some of the reasons why that could be the case? Now, there are quite a few of those, but you'll recognise this, David. Often, where there are problems in financial systems, it comes down often to incentives. And so the incentives in traditional investing and in super is pretty easy. It's what you get paid for doing, and then how you get measured. And everybody knows that the highest risk-adjusted investment returns over the longest period are the winners. We have league tables that show the top funds. It's just absolutely welded into the system, and that's how you measure success. And then you look at, well, do people get paid for doing well at that? Yes, they absolutely do. So missing incentives is where are the prizes for funds that are decarbonising and investing in renewable energy? We haven't really built those yet, so that's one problem.
I'd like to step back from that a second, because I think that's looking at the investment side. But I think some of our readers, because this is a new topic, might be interested in understanding that it's the flows into superannuation that are really driving so much assets, and therefore where the social questions of where they're invested. And it's not really all about performance at the end. It's about the fact that we have compulsory superannuation, and actually we have industry funds, which have come to completely dominate the industry. And even within the industry funds, isn't it fair to say that there's domination of those by very concentrated industry now at the top, like many another Australian industries? So in the end, we've got a few little committees and, half a dozen investment managers that are kind of, and I'm going to sound like a radical here, which I'm not, but kind of don't have that much control over them. They're a kind of a law unto themselves as to what they're doing. That's my kind of view, but I wondered if you could just step back and talk a little bit about this process of money flowing into industry super.
Yeah.
And what your thoughts are about what's going to happen if it keeps going like this.
Okay, well, look, you're absolutely right. There are a couple of big trends in the upper regulated sector, and one of them is now that we're at 12% compulsory contributions, the flows are even greater. And of course, the bigger the fund, the bigger the inflows it receives. So where we sit at the moment is there are two very, very large super funds. I don't need to name the names because that gets boring. So there are two massive super funds. Then there's a pack of about 5, really big ones. We're talking those guys have all got over $100 billion of member savings, and then it goes out to about 15, so that the 15 top funds are basically everything you need to know about big super, and it's probably a top 8, and then the top 2 at the very top. So it is absolutely rapidly concentrating. However, as that's happening, internalising of investment has been a massive trend, particularly over the last, say, 5, but probably 10 years, to the point where there are a lot of asset classes where largely the funds are doing their own, they're eating their own cooking. So even where you've got IFM investors, which is a massive vehicle that invests on behalf of many of the industry or not-for-profit funds, they're doing stuff on top of that. So IFM investors are still all whirring away, but funds are deciding to do other big sort of lumpy real asset type investing, all by themselves or in tandem with other parties. So,
and is it fair to say that the funds, I think that the super funds are now bigger than the stock market, but in any event, most of the money, if we turn back to the investments now, and it's not just where they are today, it's the fact that this compulsory super is going to mean that these concentrated funds are going to keep growing and going to become, in my opinion, the dominant economic institutions in the Australian economy. And so they've outgrown Australia, haven't they? And nearly all the incremental money is going to get invested offshore. And my question to you really is that really what we want, all of our savings to be invested offshore at the margin?
Look, that's a really great question. So where that all started, I suppose, was the realisation that you can't just keep pouring money into the ASX. And you can measure, we hit, 15 years ago, we noticed that the ASX, relative to our GDP, so we're about a 15th order, they always do this in US dollars, we're about a 15th order GDP ranking in the world. So if you rank the top companies and you get down to us, we're about 15th. Go over to the listed stock exchanges, you run your eye down, and we hover around the 10th or 11th, and this has been going on for 15 years at least. And you think, well, why is that? And the answer is super. So you can't just keep... So some time ago, there was a sort of signpost that said, logically, look, you can't just keep tipping money into listed equities in Australia. You've got to find somewhere else to invest this money. That sort of made sense for a while, but frankly, I think what we need to do in decarbonising our own economy and the massive amounts of capital that we need right here in Australia, and this sounds quite nationalistic, and I'll sort of live with that for a while, is actually, I think, signposting. One of the most enjoyable podcasts you guys have done was the Dino Otranto one of a couple of weeks ago. Now, imagine if Super was being asked to fund the sort of activities that Fortescue is doing in the Pilbara. And frankly, there are many equivalents, other industries that need decarbonising right here, not in Britain or certainly not in the United States. So that gets very tricky.
It does. Just to put some numbers on it, and I haven't done this some myself, but I mean, if we look at what does 12% of actually add up to in incremental dollars going into super in a year?
Oh, this is really finger in the air stuff, but I'd say about 150 billion.
And so what we can say is each of those 150 billions every year, it's all essentially going to go, or the 80% of it's now going to go offshore. I mean, I've made that 80% up.
Yeah, no, well, you're getting close. It's about 70 cents of the marginal dollar going overseas. Yep, so that's right. But where we are now is, again, everything keeps moving. Where we are now, interestingly, and the self-managed sector has been in this position for at least 5 years, there's actually a net outflow when you look at the amount of contributions made in each year, and then you look at the cohort of people who are in retirement and they're drawing their savings. Sure, the big pot of money is growing in investment return sense, but the actual in and out flows are actually, it's been in net outflow now for, as I say, for at least 5 years, and Big Super will go there as well. So you have to be very careful that you're measuring all the right flows.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I had to remember about that. Now, the other thing, and Giles, sorry, but I've been thinking about this quite hard for a while myself, and actually wrote quite a big note about it myself, is that, and this came about when I was talking to Transgrid, which is the New South Wales transmission owner, that they wanted money, but when they approached super funds, they found it quite hard to get because of the Your Super sort of returns, which kind of sets, for those listeners that don't know, it sets a benchmark return. And if you perform poorly against that benchmark, you get a very bad rap over the knuckles, and such that you might even go out of business. And this encourages what us in the investment banking world have always talked about, index hugging. You can't really invest in anything other than what everyone else is investing in, because otherwise you run the risk of underperforming your benchmark. And so this is another, what I think of as really significant barrier to actually investing in unlisted Australian infrastructure, like renewable energy assets, like transmission flows. Like transmission might have an acceptable risk-adjusted return. It does by definition, because that's what the regulator lets it earn. But that might still not meet the superannuation benchmark.
No, absolutely correct. That's another log in my wood heap. So that's a big log that's sort of sitting on top of progress. Now, the good thing, David, is it's among people who think about this stuff, it's well known that that's a problem, and it's all about, as David quite correctly says, there's a range of benchmarks, but they're heavily. I'll pick the worst offender. Imagine benchmarking to the ASX 200. How renewable energy friendly do you think that is? So the problem's well known, and there's an open consultation in relation to this test. It's been fiddled with far too often, which tells you that it was possibly well intentioned, and it's chased the right funds out of the industry so far. But it does need changing in this respect. It needs quite a different approach than just nominating benchmarks, because the world is moving too quickly. Benchmarks, after all, are only commercial creations that can change. And so everybody believes there should be accountability and some form of performance measure, but delineating benchmarks that are actually specified in regulation, so changing them is actually quite hard, is really not the way to go. And that message has been very clearly, and I'm sort of reliably informed that there will be, but it's a political process that has to be gone through, and anything to do with climate and super is pretty toxic. So that's being worked on, but it's not fixed yet. So that's another blocker. Another one is the view that some take, and this is possibly not helped by the very same package that you're talking about that introduced this performance test in 2020, also purported to beef up the duties that trustees have to act in the best interests. The word financial was shoved into that phrase, so that they have to act in the best financial interests. That was probably always what was intended, but the industry has taken perhaps with a little bit of accompanying chest beatings from the people who've introduced that policy. The industry stood back and thought, oh, hang on, that means only being focused on money. So only being focused on a relatively short-term return that you can show, oh, look, we're acting in members' interests because we've got high investment return. And that the conservative view of this is that you can't take into account other sorts of benefits, like benefiting a future cohort by decarbonising the portfolio, all the sort of things that you might want to think about in renewable energy investing. Some people believe, well, you're not allowed to think about those things. My view is that's wrong.
Australia's future and the future generations. But anyway, sorry, over to you, Giles.
Well, I'm just wondering if we can get to the big, the main thrust of the article that you wrote for us and of your paper that you wrote for the Connexus Institute. And this is about the introduction of a value of emissions reduction framework, which is basically just getting the super funds to carry their own sort of voluntary or a carbon price. I mean, it's been something that's been used by many companies already. It's been something that's used, as you point out, by the Australian Energy Regulator, newly done so, actually, because we've only just written climate and environment into the National Electricity Law. How would this work with the super industry, and what would it change?
Yeah, well, so it's basically, I suppose it's borrowing from a few people. I've got to give a nod to Tim Buckley here, because some time ago I spoke to Tim about this, and I had a bunch of ideas, including a European idea where you've got a sort of a decarbonisation benchmark and so on. He said, oh, what about just having an internal carbon price for super funds? I thought, oh, that sounds like an interesting idea. So I took it off and road tested and found what I thought was an appropriate price and wrote up a paper. And so 3 cheers for Tim on that one. And then secondly, Matt Keen's fantastic phrase from his Sector Pathways review, the zero carbon mindset. So the two things that struck me that were missing in most large super funds, and admittedly they've got an awful lot of things to do, and governments are very keen on giving them more to do, but it just seemed to me that they weren't thinking about carbon enough, and only a very small number of them had voluntarily adopted their own carbon prices. So then I thought, well, where could we get a carbon price? I found the Australian Energy Regulator one. Now, that might not be the boffins who know a lot more about this than me might say, well, that's a pretty weak price. It needs to be. And I'd say, well, okay, gear it up by a factor. What do you reckon? You take the AER price that goes all the way out to 2050, and they did a lot of work to.
It's actually quite a big price.
Yeah,
you'd find a lot of companies that wouldn't would grumble about it. But sorry.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm big enough to say, well, if the experts say it isn't a big enough price, well, let's make it bigger. But I'll leave that to others. So, the beauty of it is also that it was created outside the super industry, so that solves a big problem. So there are no vested superannuation interests have been involved in creating this price. It's transparent, externally administered from the system. And I thought, well, what about just either APRA doing this or by legislation imposing an obligation that it marries in beautifully with the sustainability reporting standards that are going to apply for the 2027 financial year, so effectively starting on the 1st of July next year, and then we'll be getting the reports right about now. In 2 years' time, we'll be getting all the sustainability reports from super funds. So what a perfect time to get the carbon price in there. And the beauty of the reporting standards is they say, well, you don't have to have a carbon price, but if you do have one, you've got to tell us all about how you've applied it and so on. I thought, oh, great, let's get the price there, and then we'll have the funds talking about it. But the main thing, I think, if you really think crudely about investing in a super fund, there are sort of three things that you do. You buy, you hold on to things, or you sell them. And at each one of those points, having a carbon price that is effectively injected into your thinking. So why would I hold this carbon price if it's costing, why would I hold this asset if it's costing us so much in carbon price terms, and same on the buy-sell. So I thought, well, what a perfect way, without it being a massive intervention, is just to make every super fund apply uniformly. And it's all very well to have the top 2 or 3 funds using a carbon price, but the middle one and the bottom one, they're not. And in a compulsory system, you want to make sure that, the members are generally speaking being treated equally. So that's really, in a nutshell, the idea.
So, yeah, and you sort of make the point that it's about them to get to think about the carbon price, because you say here that it's not actually a tax.
No, there are no payments or anything. No.
It's a shadow price, but it must have some impact. I mean, the naysayers would say, well, now you're forcing people to invest in things which might not deliver as big a return or something like that. I don't know. What would your response be to that?
Well, look, I suppose coming back to the best financial interest duty, it's absolutely essential for a fund to sit down and be able to articulate and document and have a rock solid case for we're investing in this asset because it's giving us an investment return of X. There are the decarbonisation piece is an additional benefit. It's just like sitting down and deciding to buy a government bond as opposed to an equity. I can point to the people doing that and going, oh, but you're not going to get as high a return with that. Yes, they'll say, but the volatility and all these other benefits, and that's basically at the very heart of modern portfolio theory, and climate's just another piece of that. The board that's done their homework would say, well, stranded assets, what happens if there's a massive repricing and your flashy assets that have got no regard for carbon, we don't know when, we don't know how, and we don't know how much by, suddenly just go through the floor. And then we'll say, well, gee.
It's interesting. If you look at Bloomberg, they've got a guy there who would like to say that some 30 or 40% of the American GDP in the last 5 to 10 years has actually been driven by repair from, weather-related damages of one sort or another, and that the companies exposed to that have actually been outperforming the US market. So you could argue there's a price system as well. But it really comes down to the people, doesn't it? I mean, you can have all these rules, and it's nice to have things in the rules, but at the very top, in these giant super funds, it would be enough if the people there actually really cared. That's what I would say.
And look, David, I'm speaking in very general terms. There are super funds who, relatively speaking, are doing a great job. These things take time. I'd like to do a podcast like this in 5 years' time and be looking back and talking about just what a great job most of the super funds in this country have done. Where things seem a little bit anemic at the moment, but it's amazing how quickly these things. And when you think about it, and again, you guys talk about this on the podcast all the time. This current government in its second term has thrown the absolute kitchen sink at incentivising, supporting, capping and collaring, making projects viable, and it's just a matter of just that tap opening up. And some funds have had to upskill themselves and get set up for this, but I just feel in my bones that
But they can't. I mean, if you were to put a carbon price in now, the need is, if we look at, say, the capacity investment scheme, there's something like about 70 billion. So 6 months worth of overseas investments that needs to be funded. Maybe it's 100 billion that needs to be funded over the next few years to build the wind and the solar and the associated transmission. It's within the capability of the super industry to do that so easily, and yet they don't, or they haven't. I mean, the investments, the industry is not owned by the Australian super funds. It's owned by and large, foreign companies with few Australian investors like Twiggy Forrest and the like, and QIC, which is not a super fund. So, they've had when you say, let's look forward 5 years, I mean, I'd like to look back over the last 10 years and see how little progress has been made and how there is this great pool of money there. But I also hear you, it's very socialist for people to be telling super funds how they should invest. That's not how it should work. But I just feel it's a little out of control and unbalanced at the moment.
Well, and another aspect of this is our sovereign wealth fund, the Future Fund, has really been, this is a pretty tough thing to say, but has really been so far, and I think there are murmurs of change, but has been a real laggard in this respect, particularly when you compare it regionally. It just happens to sit within a very, if I can say, sort of embarrassing part of the world when you've got NZ Super and the GIC to compare yourself with, who are kind of exemplars in terms of how their asset allocation, what they're doing, the benchmarks, the net zero expectations they've set on themselves, and the future funds kind of nowhere to be seen. So that's unhelpful.
Is that political?
It's been very political. You saw this late last year when a very minor tweak was made to their investment mandate to sort of give them a bit of a hurry, or give them a bit of headroom, I suppose, to do something in this space. And around housing, you had all the usual suspects coming out and talking about boondoggling, and it's the end of the anyway. So, but it is difficult. What the reason it's difficult is that's a big pot of money effectively controlled by the government. Now a lot of effort was made to not allow the arm of the government that's in power to come in and tweak the dials on it. We all respect that. But it just has been a sort of no-go zone in terms of getting them go. Even their, if you look at their...
they just did invest some more in Tilt.
I noticed that in the paper today. So that's great, but it just would be great if there were a whole lot more Tilts and all the super funds were investing in them as well. In fact, Tilt is a really good example. So one thing that has been lacking is the sort of intermediation that Tilt represents. So it's all very well having all these great big complicated...
The operator and stuff like that. The super funds, they don't have the vehicles.
That's right. That's
where it comes down to the people. If they really wanted to, they could make it happen. If there was a war on, we would see it hopefully going a bit better. It would be in deep trouble.
Yeah.
So, Jeremy, if we, looking at the carbon price, it's not that small. You've got $66 per tonne in 2023, and this is borrowing from what the AER uses for its recommendations and its judgments, rising to 135 by 2033 and 420 by 2050. That'll give connections to some of the naysayers who are listening in. If we had such a carbon price introduced, what do you think would be the effect on that? And sort of a supplementary question. One of the big things... the big struggles in the listed sector in Australia is that no renewables industry can last very long in renewables simply because of the nature of its business and presumably the way they're treated by the super funds. And they will end up being, share prices wallowing and being delisted. So I guess part two of my question is, would that help renewables wanting to be listed? And two, what do you think? Have you managed to sort of crunch the numbers on what that carbon price, voluntary as it is, might it double the amount of investments? Might it lift it from 1% to 2% to 3%, or haven't you quite got that far yet?
I guess it's sort of crystal ball gazing, but you make a good point. On the other hand, David was quite right. You'd be surprised the number of major Australian corporates that have had, some of them are not as robust as this, I should say, but have actually become very used to using carbon prices over the years. And the other thing is just, and again, this is something you guys talk about all the time, this is not static from a global point of view. So if we don't do something like this and we just continue to languish, the risk of us becoming sort of walled off by carbon adjustment mechanisms in our international trade, and we've got so much to lose if we don't get that right. So it's pretty hard to judge going forward. I suppose I'd respond by also saying, well, look, the AER is using this price, and it wants to see proposals and participants, adopting these kind of numbers in what they're doing. So it remains to be seen. And it seems a real carbon price, like the one we had and then which was abolished, just seems to be political poison. And I just don't think it's worth. I don't think it's worth bringing that up.
No, it's not. It's probably not going to happen. I mean, David sort of alluded to it before, and I'm kind of interested in about. You've talked to a lot of people within the super industry and what sort of people these people are. I mean, we don't hear about the super industry very much in an active way. I mean, we probably saw them the most active when Brookfield made a bid for Origin Energy, listed company, had grand plans for a reasonably rapid transition. That was knocked back by one particular super company. And maybe another one who had its interests and priorities elsewhere, mostly with the fossil fuel industry. And Brookfield then went on to buy Neoen, which is a listed company in France, and will implement its strategy through that one. And Origin's now going slower than most people would hope in its transition. So, where did I start the question? It was basically, yes, a lot of these people, what drives them, what motivates them, who are they? Are they sort of, are they kind of representative of society and some sort of, believe in climate change and some of them don't? Are they sort of driven by their short-term reimbursements? Do some of them have this real passion for thinking? I mean, as you make this point in your article and in your paper that these, the people who are coming in now to the super industry who are contributing are looking for their retirement in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years' time. What sort of world will they be living in, want to live in, and where would they like their money to be invested?
Oh, look, you absolutely can frame it as actually a retirement problem, both in terms of people who are our age. So let's just say you and I decided to throw in the towel and fully retire, right now. We could, given you can do it a number of times. It's not, it's not finite, and we're going to be on average. I'm just talking about longevity numbers here, but we could well be alive in our 90s. That sounds crazy, and things have really increased in terms of average life expectancies these days. And so, what goes on in the next 25 to 30 years is actually also relevant to our retirement, let alone the people who are currently 25 and could well be alive in 2100, which just, by the way, is 50 years past the magic 2050. So it is absolutely a retirement problem. It's no point having a sack full of money, but you can't go outside. So there are many, many different ways you can sort of get
So I'm just interested if we could just come back to the general topic of super again. You made the point that super funds grow because they get return on investment and because they get net inflows, and that at the smaller end of the market, I think you said at the moment, the net inflows are in fact negative, and that's going to happen to the big side as well. Now, I don't quite understand the population dynamics that would drive that. Australia's population has been growing rapidly, and I would have thought that meant that more people were coming into the super fund rather than exiting, and that therefore...
Yeah, you're right. You're right, except that, it differs. So if you pick, just for example, Aussie Super, it's got big everything. So it's got 3 million members. I'm speaking in round terms. I hope not too many Australian super people are listening, but this is pretty close. It's got 3 million members. It might get 20 billion of inflows each year.
If you say something interesting, I guarantee they will be listening eventually.
Yeah, I'm quite used to it, David. So, and it's also got a massive number of people already in retirement and coming into retirement. So there are big flows and swings each way. But just coming back to your numbers thing, just think about it this way. So for every $1, and in retirement income, you've always got to talk about real dollars sort of after inflation. So for every $1 real that you put in while you're working, you want to actually get your hand on 3 of those in retirement. That's the growth. So the sort of after inflation growth of your contributions for the whole thing to work properly. So you're putting in, let's just say 1 unit per time period in your accumulation phase of 40 years, and then when you're in retirement, in the relevant time period, you want to pull 3 of that out and spend it. That's in the now, of course, people don't do that; they generally hoard it. But that's the maths of how this whole thing works. So the draw, the pull, and that's why in self-managed land, you're just getting that. People have worked hard, they've invested money well, and they want to get their hands on that in retirement.
I wanted to just bring it back to your carbon price thing and how that might affect, because I just thought it would just be good for the listeners just to sort of hear something about how you illustrate the effect of this carbon price. And you talked about it, you give the example between sort of investing in a gas-fired power plant or I guess big battery or renewable energy project or a big battery. I mean, basically what you're saying is that this having a shadow carbon price will tip the balance in favour of the renewable asset.
Yeah, all other things being equal, it'll put a lot of strain. At the moment, that's just treated as an externality. It doesn't exist on the spreadsheet. It actually, we know it does exist, and this is just forcing reality onto the super funds in that buy, hold, sell sequence that I was talking about.
Which is exactly what the Australian Energy Regulator did when it was considering Broken Hill a couple of years ago and decided, well, all things being equal, let's just go for the diesel generator because it wasn't compelled to, it didn't have that shadow carbon price then, so it ignored the battery, which would have been really useful if it had actually been there and allowed to do what it was supposed to do.
I actually think there's a deeper issue. Like public companies don't just have a board, they actually have shareholders, and the shareholders get votes every year. And have over the time that public companies have existed, they've become a kind of they understand as generally that they do have votes, and if they get unhappy, like the institutions, exert their power on public companies, but there isn't a corresponding thing to institutions really to exert their power over industry super funds. Industry super funds don't have big masses of members that come and go, do they? Just like that, or am I?
No, you're right. You think of any funds management structure. Let's be fairer and not single out the not-for-profit sector. But you think of any managed fund that you might invest in, whether that's called super or non-super. It's an odd outcome, isn't it? That you put your money into this thing that's being managed by somebody. And there are votes in respect of the portfolios that those funds invest in, but it's very difficult to say, hey, I don't like the people who are actually managing this fund, and I want to say in whether they're there or not.
It's a trust structure, isn't it? Ultimately,
it is.
And trustees, in my opinion, are notoriously difficult. They're designed to separate out management and control, and to be as hard to get good oversight, and that's my real concern with big super, that who's looking after. Really, everything relies on however many trustees there are and how they get appointed, and it just becomes a bit of a club, and I don't like that very much as a general statement for such a huge pool of money that's becoming ever more dominant.
Well, that's right, and I suppose that's why you see an almost never-ending rounds of reforms and more transparency and that kind of thing. But ultimately, you're absolutely right. There isn't the accountability. It's very difficult to spill, the board of a trustee or indeed a fund manager. It doesn't matter what structure you're in. You're sort of stuck with. I mean, you can pick up your money and take it elsewhere. But what you're talking about, the new fund you take it to is constituted in pretty much the same way, and it is compulsory.
And super funds, if we just continue on this stuff, and I apologise, but that's investments is kind of what I've done for a long time. You do find, in response to Giles's point, that public companies are not that well suited to infrastructure assets as a general statement. We've tried that a lot of times, and we've seen through the histories that, in fact, the stock market ultimately wants growth companies that are investing in returns and like data centers and the future is kind of what, whereas things that offer steady returns are very well suited to super funds where, as we've said, you want returns to grow steadily through time and to offer a returns commensurate with the way that funds are going in. So in many ways, if they have the right platform, super funds are the ideal owners of wind and solar assets and transmission, and you see them owning roads and things like that. Yeah.
Well, yes, you're. If I can put it this way, David, you're being a bit more of a purist, and so how I hear what you're saying is, I say, well, evidence of that is that if you look at the Canadian pension funds that are almost entirely defined benefit funds, they just can't get enough of this stuff, and in fact, the number of times they've come over and knocked off Australian super fund bidders for these assets is just phenomenal, because in that model, that steady return over the years, no volatility, that's exactly how you back a defined benefit promise. You don't have to shoot any lights out, all that kind of thing. So that's their fodder. And the Australian funds are in this funny mixture because they've got the pressure of the performance test on them. It's we inevitably come back to talking about the retirement phase. The retirement phase of a system, even like ours, ought to be effectively backed by those sort of assets that can just provide you really, you'd even chuck a bit of housing in there, just steady cash flows, steady as she goes.
Build for rent.
Yeah, but the drivers and the way the industry measures itself and all that kind of stuff, it doesn't gel well with that.
So, Jeremy, your proposal's out there now in the open. There's sort of discussions around about sort of, super funds getting more involved in the clean energy transition. So what are the chances? What's the feeling out there? What's the chances of such a thing being introduced?
Oh, well, we know Chris Bowen listens to every one of these shows, Charles, so...
In that case, it's done well.
But he's a busy... No, I feel I generally...
He might be on the plane to Berlin.
Yes, he may well. Now, look, that and other things. I mean,
but
the guys...
Jim Chalmers listening as well at the moment.
That's true. It does deal with some... Chris is not involved in super anymore, and look, he's got a million things on his plate, and this is just a fairly self-contained idea. It would be nice if it had a little bit of a run. But I think Chris has probably got a pretty full order book from now until 2030.
Okay. Right. Well, let's hope it is taken up and run with it, because it will make it so much easier. David, any final questions you got?
I don't know, just the observation. I'm glad we had this discussion. I've been wanting to talk more about super for ages and to hear from someone who knows what they're talking about. Unlike myself, and Giles knows what he's talking about. And so it's just great to have this discussion about what I think is a very important topic. And if it helps in any way to get those super funds, which do have the capital and could be the actual enabler of this the financier of this transition, they could do it if they were so minded.
Absolutely.
Any final thoughts on that, Jeremy?
Oh, well, look, I think there are funds that are at the top of their pack, if you like, within the ecosystem of super, who are using carbon prices, who are motivated, who are doing things and investing in these sort of projects. Unfortunately, overall, super funds as a class are pretty opaque when it comes to coughing up, well, what exactly have you invested
in? Disclosure. That's another thing we didn't.
Yeah.
Sorry, you've started me on disclosure. We'll be going for another 20 minutes. Sorry.
Well, I feel partly responsible for this because all that time ago I recommended, based on what, in fact, Morningstar gave me this one. It was like a recommendation on a plate. They wrote me this fantastic letter. This is back in 2009. It said, "Do you realise that of all of the mature funds management and pension systems in the world," and they rattled off the United States and all around the world, there's no regular disclosure back to not just the members, but researchers and all sorts of people who are interested in this. There's no regular disclosure of where the money's gone. And I thought, I just read this and thought, oh, what? That can't be right. And so I checked up, and sure enough, the US has got I think it's either quarterly or 6 monthly. It's just a great big spreadsheet, intelligently set out, so you can see what the money's been invested in. And country after country had adopted this, and we didn't have one. I thought, oh well, there's recommendation number one, bang. Anyway, the industry resisted and delayed, and we can't do this because, people who own houses don't disclose what their valuations are. No, we can't possibly do this. You pick up a REIT annual report, and the properties that it owns are all listed there, and they've got
It's disgraceful.
just absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, it finally got passed, but it was so watered down. And when I was actually researching for this paper, I thought, oh, great, I'll go and look at my Butte portfolio holding disclosure regime disclosures, and I'll be able to find out, how much money these guys have got invested in renewable energy. And I'm embarrassed to say I couldn't make head or tail of what the disclosures were.
That's the thing. Okay, so we look at it. What you see is no accountability, no ability for people to really control the business or affect change, and no disclosure. I mean, if you want to take of Australia's biggest these days financial institutions that are growing at that are growing and have outflows. I mean, I think myself, the system, it's time for an overhaul. Compulsory superannuation is a wonderful thing, but it's got to a size where we need to think harder about it.
Yep. Look, there's always room for improvement, but particularly in this area. And as I say, we have got the sustainability reporting regime coming. We didn't water it down like Europe. We got in last year in September, passed the legislation. The dates when it comes in are all there. The Europeans got caught in the head of the Trump headlights, and they've done all sorts of watering down and rolling back. None of that in Australia. So we can thank good management and good luck for that. So maybe that in itself, when a super fund actually has to fully disclose what it's doing here, and who knows what the response to that will be. I mean, are we going to? Is there going to be a big report in the Sydney Morning Herald going, "Oh, here, look, check your super fund's emissions reporting"? We don't know, but it could be. It could be just the incentive we need.
Well, Jeremy, I never thought I'd be spending 45 minutes talking about the super industry, but then I never expected to be spending 20 years writing about the electricity industry either. So thank you very much for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, Giles.
Yeah, no, it's actually been quite fascinating. So look, thanks very much for joining us, and we'll be back with some news of the week after this break. And that was Jeremy Cooper with his... talking about super. David, I found that really very interesting.
Well, it's a massive topic, of course. We didn't even get onto the fact that the reality, as opposed to talking about all the structural issues, is that a lot of the industry super is, of course, union dominated, and there've been all these mainstream news stories about CFMEU directors and so on and so forth, which we, of course, are not going to get into here. The point made to me by my good friend Jeff Warren, who is an expert on this topic as well, and in fact writes at Connects us quite regularly, was that, as we discussed in the interview, most of the super fund assets are held in listed shares. Now, one of the reasons, which is not that well suited to financing renewable assets, one of the reasons, in fact, probably the main reason for that, or one of the reasons, is that the liquidity requirement. Any super fund member can take their money out at will. And if you're going to take your money out, you can't be taking it out of some, Windle solar farm and just you can only take it out of shares, essentially. So in essence, there's a structural sort of thing about the super funds that they have to have a certain amount in liquid assets, most of the money, as it turns out.
Is that right, though? I mean, $4.6 trillion in total assets, surely they can find a couple of billion to put into wind and solar.
Oh, no, they could do more. There's no question they can do a lot more. That's beyond question, but there are limits. That's all I'm trying to talk about.
Okay, fair enough. Okay. Well, we'll see how that plays out. It's a fairly sensible suggestion, I think, to adopt the same pricing as the Australian Energy Regulator, which it uses now for as its guide for making decisions on regulatory judgment. So why not for the super industry?
It sounds good. It's hard to operationalise. Let me just say that. If you're buying DHP shares, what carbon price are you going to use in that investment decision?
What carbon price do they
know
use?
what BHP's carbon emissions are and work it into the decision. But anyway, I don't. We had a good discussion of super. We should go on to the news of the week. That's what we're doing now, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Well, look, I think the biggest came with the biggest battery. Waratah super battery, which was supposed to be operating a couple of months ago to help fill the gap for the assumed retirement of the Iranian coal generator in August 2025. Got pretty close to reaching full commissioning. A really interesting project, one, because it's operating as a giant shock absorber, two, because it's the most powerful battery ever to be built in the world, in Australia and possibly the world, and is actually the biggest machine to be connected to the Australian grid. But something went very awry a couple of weeks ago. We only found out in the last few days that one of the transformers failed spectacularly, according to an internal memo.
Was it one?
Well, one failed spectacularly and another one had problems, and the third one was inspected. Now, one of them is still operating, definitely, and the battery is still acting as a smaller shock absorber. It's sort of done an interim contract, so it's delivering at half its capacity. But when it can actually get to the rest of the capacity is unknown, because it needs a new transformer, and that could take, well, it could take 12 months, it could take 24 months. Perhaps if they rang up nicely and paid a lot of money, they could get one built sooner. But it sounds like a bit of a mess, and everyone's been very hush-hush and shy about it. So,
it's an old stock market adage, Giles, that, well, there's two versions of it. Success has many parents and failure is an orphan. And the other version of it is that good news travels very quickly, bad news travels very slowly.
Well, I think that's exactly the point. Look, I guess the other thing to highlight is just one of the issues and the difficulties of just bringing really, really big projects to the market. I guess we've seen that with the McIntyre wind farm, which was to be the biggest, but at the time it reached its full capacity, would have already been overtaken by Golden Plains.
Is it going to reach full capacity?
Well, we don't know. Look, well, I guess there's a couple of things to observe here, and it's not really a reflection of the people involved, but both of them have new technologies which are new to the market. So McIntyre is Nordex turbines. They haven't done much in Australia, and just sort of working through the incredibly challenging grid connection. We've seen that with many, many different players come to the market and find it really, really hard to do these things. Acacia, the Waratah battery built by Acacia was using Pylon technology, the US battery provider, which actually filed for bankruptcy protection and hadn't done a project in Australia before. Yet it was attempting the biggest battery in the country. So, yeah, these balance of plant issues and the connection issues are quite important. But look, maybe it was just simply a matter of something just went very wrong with the transformer. We finally heard from the transformer people.
Well, I find
they're looking at it, and they don't know whether it was their problem or somebody else's problem. So,
well, Giles, the first thing is, if it was just an unusual statistical thing, why would it be two transformers and not one? That's the first question I have to ask. And secondly, I think, you can be a new player, you can take so much risk, but if you want to be a new player on the market and use new technology, then you're compounding your risks. That's another point I would make. And the third point I would make is incidental to this, which is just that getting connected takes a long time in Australia. I was looking at a study of how much batteries are being built globally, cells, as opposed to how much has been installed. And they were using studies of batteries in Australia, pointing out that, if you use the Tesla Megapack, say in Melbourne, that had to go to, the cells were manufactured in China, then they had to go off to California to be assembled into the Megapacks, and then they got to Australia. But it didn't matter that much because they were still working on the connection study.
That's it. Well, look, just on your second point, it's an interesting point about whether, the experience. One of the criteria of this tender for this battery was that the person or the entity delivering it must have a lot of experience in doing just that. But this was actually Acacia Energy's first ever project. Now, Acacia Energy have done extremely well ever since then and have already emerged as the biggest, overtaking Neoen as the biggest provider of energy storage in Australia. If you think about contracts of under construction, commissioning, and
but not necessarily operating.
Not necessarily operating, no.
So you can, yes. And look, in the end, you and I have next to no information. You can, no doubt, more information will gradually come to light. But the bottom line, the consequences. Now, let's just talk about the consequences of this, because they could be significant. The first thing that makes me ask, as Renew Economy wrote recently, Transgrid recently led a contract for some syncons that are necessary to enable Eraring to close, did they not?
Yes, they did.
And my first question is, does this reduced battery capacity actually impact on the ability of the grid to manage frequency and stuff like that, and transmission bottlenecks if Eraring's not there? So might it cause Eraring closure to be delayed all of itself? I don't know.
Not in those things. I mean, I think this battery was quite specific, acting as a shock absorber, basically sitting there on standby to allow the transmission lines to be run at full capacity. I don't know that it was. Look, I don't know the answer to that question, but I suspect not. But I guess if you don't have that as much renewables coming into the big load centres, then that increases scarcity, which inevitably puts the prices up, particularly if Eraring's not there. But yeah. We don't know much. We look forward to learning more. On good news, David, and we have to wrap this up soon because I have to go pick up my grandson from the childcare centre. So I'm in Sydney. So
you're putting on LinkedIn, proud dad and granddad. That's what you.
Anyway, look, some good news. We saw some financial close of a couple of projects this week. Most notably, I thought, was Octopus Australia with the Blind Creek solar battery and hybrid. Yes, another solar battery hybrid, but it's reached financial close. It's got a offtake agreement apparently, but they haven't told us who it is yet. But it was interesting, and construction has started. And there was another one too, and I'm buggered if I can remember what it was.
And I think renewable shares have continued to be very high on 5-minute basis. No doubt we'll see some more that continuing to develop. It is nice to see a new project, a utility scale one, but I'm bored waiting for all these wind projects to get announced as going ahead, to be honest. I mean, you go down and you hear the coalition talking about net zero. You see inquiries in public and territories. There's so much crap going on at the moment, if I can just put it that way. But the basic guts of it is we've still got to build some new wind farms. That's really, I've been focused on that for years. I'm still focused on it, but I'm a bit worried I'm going to ossify before I can actually say anything positive.
Well, we look forward to hearing about these wind farm financial investment closes. I guess that's one thing we should note today also is that AGL finally did sell out of its last stake in Tilt. Well, we left 0.1 or 0.01% in there for some reason, presumably to do with lawyers and rights or something like that. But anyway, it sold that stake, and I guess we can look forward to Tilt. And it's pretty much said as much that it hopes to reach financial investment close on a couple of wind farms, probably Palmer and Waddy, sometime soon, hopefully before the end of the year.
Well, Giles, there's lots of stuff to say. We talked about superannuation, and I'm sure we didn't even really scratch the surface, but it is great to talk about this important topic for Australians and where their money, their savings have been invested. Next week, we're going to be talking, I hope, about the environment. So we're starting to move around a bit, aren't we?
That's a good thing, David. Talking about moving around, I got to hop from the car and pick up grandson number one. So thank you very much for joining me and rushing back from your appointments in town.
Well, I've got an 1,100 kilometre drive in an EV tomorrow. So I reckon that's as far as most people are going to drive on a day. But anyway.
That'll take you at least a week in an electric car, wouldn't it, David?
A week to talk about it, Charles. Maybe only a day to drive it.
Well, good on you. Thanks to Jeremy Cooper, of course, for joining us. That was really great to have that chat. Thanks to our sponsors, Evergen and Pylon. Thanks to everybody out there listening to us, and we look forward to catching up with you soon. And that's it for this week. Bye for now.